Welcome back to I Rest My Case, a podcast series with me, Dean Strang.
And me, Jonathan Goldberg, KC.
We are two lawyers of unfortunately long practice. I primarily in the U.S. and Jonathan primarily in the United Kingdom. In each episode of our podcast, we discuss and dissect a famous legal case, contemporary or historical. We consider what was at stake, the consequences for those involved, and for the broader societies. We try to pull back the curtain on courtroom trials and shed what light we can on the how, not just the why, of the criminal justice machinery, asking always, has it served the public well in the end? Today's episode, Jeffrey Epstein, whose name is well known, and some of those associated with him, Ghislaine Maxwell and Prince Andrew, one of the many powerful men in Epstein's orbit. The cases themselves date back to 2006 and are very much in the headlines today still, aren't they, Jonathan?
Absolutely.
Well, indeed, the complexities of this tangle of both criminal and civil cases are many. Maybe an easy place to start is with the first complexity, which is how the hell do we pronounce Ms. Maxwell's first name?
Ghislaine, I think, is the right way to pronounce it. And certainly her father's yacht, from which he fell into the sea in 1991, which in some ways is the absolute beginning of this story, was called the Lady Ghislaine after his favorite child, the youngest daughter. So perhaps a good place to begin, Dean, is if we sketch the three main characters of our two-part episode today: Ghislaine herself, Jeffrey Epstein, and then, of course, Prince Andrew. Shall I begin with Ghislaine?
Would you?
Well, we begin logically with her famous and remarkable father. Robert Maxwell, who became Sir Robert, was a press baron of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. He was sort of the British equivalent of Rupert Murdoch. And Maxwell started life under the name of Jan Hoch, and he was born in Slovakia, as it now is. At the age of about 13, the Nazis invaded his hometown. He was a very poor Jewish boy living in a little shtetl, as the sort of villages were called out in the country, where Jews had small communities before Hitler. And he fled the Nazis. He was very brave. There were a number of incredible stories which have recently appeared in a very good biography of him, actually.
Most of his family perished to the Nazis, didn't they?
Nearly all his family, and possibly even all his family, perished. He fled, and he somehow found his way through occupied Europe into France, and eventually he somehow got on a boat to England, and he joined the British Army, having to lie about his age. And he joined a very what would one say, not a prestigious regiment called the Pioneer Corps. And basically what they do is bury the dead in battle, the Pioneer Corps. But nonetheless, he became an officer. He eventually became a major. And he killed many Germans, literally single-handed. He was awarded the Military Cross. There were all sorts of stories of his bravery when he overran Nazi machine gun posts single-handed and this sort of thing. And after the war, there he is, a penniless refugee still, who has now mastered basic English, but isn't yet speaking English fluently. And he has the idea to go into publishing and publish very esoteric textbooks. And where does he source them? In Germany. Because Germany, after the war, you've got lots of talented people, particularly in the scientific field, and nobody wants to touch them with a barge pole in terms of giving them a publishing house. Well, Maxwell married the two situations. Started very small, eventually became extremely big, was a brilliant, utterly ruthless businessman, notoriously so. He eventually owns Mirror Group newspapers, and the Daily Mirror, their flagship publication was, I think, in those days, the best-selling English tabloid newspaper. But somehow he got into trouble, I think because he ventured into America and bought a big American corporation, and I think he didn't do his mathematics right, and it wasn't worth what he thought it was. It was a very bad deal. So he's now facing an acute liquidity problem. And essentially, as only emerged after his death, he took the enormous pension fund of Mirror Group, which had about, I think, 40,000 employees. He took their pension fund and he injected it into the business to keep it afloat for a little bit longer. Well, eventually...
Boost the stock price.
To boost the stock price. And eventually this was about to be discovered by the accountants, and he goes out on his magnificent yacht, and off the Canary Islands, he falls into the water and drowns, and his body is found a few days later. And of course, even then, there's a mystery. Did he commit suicide? Was he pushed off the yacht by a disgruntled creditor, perhaps? And there were stories of the Mossad having been involved. Certainly, it's true to say that he was a proud Zionist, and he definitely did things for the state of Israel, some of which even to this day they whisper about, but they don't talk about. So there was that possibility, and there was the possibility that it had just been an accident and he'd fallen overboard unintentionally. To this day, nobody knows.
Boy, there's a through line there, isn't there? Starting with one mysterious death.
Yes.
Coming to another later in our story.
Yes, I hadn't thought of that, but of course you're quite right. So his favorite and youngest daughter is always the rather beautiful Ghislaine, and she's brought up in great wealth in a sort of castle near Oxford called Headington Hall. And he had, I forget whether it was 7 or 8 children, but an awful lot of children. He married a very distinguished intellectual lady who wrote a number of books herself on very esoteric subjects, his wife Betty. She had a good war. She helped the resistance in France. His home was an absolute magnet for the rich and famous and titled and distinguished in Britain. And he held wonderful parties, and he knew everybody. He was a tremendous networker. And Ghislaine was very much brought up in this ethos, and her mother was apparently a very shy, retiring person. And Ghislaine became, in the later years at least, the hostess even for her father.
But Jonathan, there's also, in all that wealth and comfort, there's a catastrophe that lurks over Ghislaine's life, at least for its first 7 years, and arguably through the course of her life, isn't there?
Yes. You're thinking of the fact that there was a brother who was a very clever boy, and he was hit by a car in a road accident, literally, I believe, the day before she was born.
I think it's 3 days after she's born.
Is it?
I think it's 3 days after he's hit by a truck. He lingers in a coma for 7 years. He dies.
And obviously, that's a tremendous tragedy for the whole family. And father dies. She's, of course, heartbroken because she was very much daddy's little girl. And not only that, this terrible scandal, everyone thought him to be an untouchable multimillionaire, and now it emerges that he's stolen the pension fund, appalling what he's done, and his 2 elder sons stand trial for it. They're said to be accomplices, and there was a long trial in the 90s. It took about 4 or 5 years before this was resolved. It was an enormously well-publicized trial in Britain. They were eventually acquitted. The actual defense being, father made us do it, and we didn't know what he was doing anyway. That was essentially the defense, and it succeeded.
And there's a parallel issue there that will recur on the principal dying in an untimely way, and then others being charged criminally for what at least would have been the primary doing of Robert Maxwell. We'll see that sort of parallel, as I say, emerge later in the story as well.
So true, because for sure, if Maxwell had lived, he would have stood trial alone. They wouldn't, I think, have needed to go for his sons, because they had to go for someone, because there was such tremendous public outrage at what had happened.
Now, Jonathan, tell me, there also seems at least some information that for all his achievements, Robert Maxwell maybe was a cold, difficult, overly demanding, manipulative, maybe abusive father.
I'm not sure I would say cold or abusive, but he was a tyrant. There's no doubt about that. He ran the house like a military operation. Everyone had to jump to his orders. He was a very tough father. He wouldn't indulge his children, particularly the boys. If they had something, they had to earn it. He was that sort of a father. And he made his boys, whom he took into the business, he made them work absolutely from the bottom before he put them in the middle and then eventually into the boardroom. But Ghislaine was always indulged. She was a trust fund baby. While there was money there, she went to Oxford. But then when he died, there was no money there. She had, I think, 100,000 a year from a particular little trust that had not been touched or taken from them. And she thought she'd make a life for herself in America. So she ends up in New York as still a woman quite young, in her 20s, very attractive. She does a bit of modeling. She mixes in the high society of New York. Wealthy people invite her to their parties. She pretends to be perhaps more aristocratic and perhaps wealthier than she really is. And eventually, she meets at a party Jeffrey Epstein and becomes his girlfriend. So over to you to describe this larger-than-life, bizarre figure of Jeffrey Epstein.
Well, Jeffrey Epstein, of our three principals here, Ghislaine Maxwell, Prince Andrew, and Jeffrey Epstein, he is both the oldest, a fact that might matter as this plays out, and born to the least privilege. He is not to the manor born. He's born in 1953 in a borough of New York to a middle-class Jewish family. He turns out to be very, very bright, very clever in school, excelling especially at mathematics. He graduates, he goes to college for a bit. That doesn't sit well with him. He drops out. Somehow he lands his first job without a college degree, teaching at an elite Manhattan day school called the Dalton School, then and now a very elite private institution, teaches math and physics, and he's fired after 2 years. He's let go for what's described simply as poor performance. Now he lands a job at Bear Stearns, the then financial investment giant, which failed in the 2008 economic collapse. But at the time, Bear Stearns was a very prestigious Wall Street firm, if you will. He rises very quickly in the ranks at Bear Stearns. I think he gets the job by drawing on a connection to a former classmate who's got a father or an uncle or somebody there. So he's becoming adept at kind of social climbing or using connections. Does, as I say, very well, makes limited partner in just 4 years or so, and then leaves almost immediately. Goes out on his own, opens up his own investment firm in his house. The first one fails, but the second startup effort that he makes succeeds wildly. By 1988, he's into this second startup effort, and he appears at least to be doing very well. Now, what's interesting is it's not clear who his clients are. It's not clear whose money he's actually managing and investing, other than one man, Leslie Wexner, who's the founder and then and now, I think, the CEO of a company called L Brands. We all know L Brands by two of its leading products or operations, if you will. The Limited, which is a vast retail shopping mall enterprise in the United States, lots and lots of outlets of The Limited, and Victoria's Secret, which is famous worldwide for lingerie, nightwear. And he is known to be Jeffrey Epstein's early and fabulously wealthy client. I think Wexner today, he's still alive and quite elderly. I think he's worth about $6 billion today. Who his other clients were never so clear, as I understand. But he begins to move up as he succeeds financially by managing the portfolios or part of the portfolios of wealthy people. He begins to do very, very well for himself. what I glean about him is that he's very bright, very clever, but not an intellectual or a deeply thoughtful sort of person. Rather, he appears, at least from public information about him, to be kind of a transactional guy, looking to make a quick buck, looking to leverage his associations with wealthy people, and then eventually just powerful people, either powerful because of their political careers, powerful because of their profession, law, powerful because of their celebrity status. People like Woody Allen and Kevin Spacey are in his orbit at one time. Famous law professor and lawyer Alan Dershowitz, a close friend. Former President Bill Clinton, before he was the former president, becomes a close associate. The current president, Donald Trump, is a longtime friend, and a variety of other very well-connected men who are powerful or wealthy or nobility, in the case of Prince Andrew and perhaps others, or some combination of all three. So the picture that emerges is a man who's materially driven, probably has some tendencies towards narcissism or at least self-advancing behavior, constantly with a transactional bent to all of it.
And as you say, it's an absolute mystery. Where did he make his money? Because when he died, his personal estate was in the region of $600 million, over $500 million, which to me is an awful lot of money. And nobody knows how he made it. As you say, there was one client of record, which is this chap Wexner of Victoria's Secrets. And even then, to do this with one client seems impossible. And yet, as you say, his Rolodex was the rich and the noble and the entitled of this world, the prime ministers, the presidents. Let's not forget Ehud Barak, the prime minister of Israel, who stayed in his house regularly. And he simply knew everybody, and everybody wanted to be on his private island in the Virgin Islands, Little St. James, or to fly on one of his 2 private jets, or to be in his ranch in New Mexico, or his house in supposedly the finest townhouse in Manhattan, or his house in Paris. I mean, it's just an extraordinary story. Where was the money from?
It really is. A middle-class striver who eventually surrounds himself with old money, high society, and the professionally very powerful.
And still only 65, I think, when he commits suicide in the summer of 2019. If it was suicide, of course, they're still arguing whether he was bumped off by the rich and powerful who didn't want their names to come out.
But at least the official finding is that it was a suicide. And that's not too difficult to believe if you look objectively at the fact that his luck finally runs out. He finally faces a significant federal indictment in the Southern District of New York, which is Manhattan. He's jailed before trial in spite of his fabulous wealth. He's held in pretrial detention, and he dies in his cell, as you say, in August of 2019 for what is determined by the medical examiner to be a suicide.
But of course, as you can tell us, still a lot of controversy around that. Guards who fell asleep, guards who should have been watching the screens but weren't, guards who were taken off duty mysteriously, and so forth. So they'll argue over that one.
And those of us familiar with federal, or for that matter, state detention centers and jails, find none of that particularly surprising.
Okay.
But you're exactly right, that as with Robert Maxwell's death in 1991, Jeffrey Epstein's death in 2019 continues to be a subject of debate, conspiracy, theories about what might actually explain the death. It's an unsettled controversy, regardless of what the facts might be.
Let's not forget that Ghislaine herself dipped her toe in the water recently when she was interviewed by Assange, the deputy U.S. Attorney General today. And she said to him that she thought it was murder. She didn't think that he'd committed suicide. You recall that? For what that's worth.
I do. But of course, she wasn't in the detention center. And what is clear is that his life had taken a significant downturn. And he was facing, at the time of his death, the real possibility of spending the rest of his life in a federal prison.
So, Dean, I think we've got to say a word about his sexual proclivities here. Much as one thought one knew from the newspapers what he was in terms of his private life, but I'm just disgusted by what I've read. I mean, it's 10 times worse than anything I could have imagined. And I think you have to compare him with somebody like the Marquis de Sade. I think he's the modern Marquis de Sade or Casanova or somebody like that, because he seems to have abused not 10, not 20, but many hundreds of underage girls, and always with the same modus operandi. He always wanted dirty massages from them. And at some point, it's clear, isn't it, that Ghislaine changed from being his girlfriend in the 90s, and it looks as though they had a perfectly normal and even passionate romantic attachment, but that ended. And after that, she sort of became his madam.
She certainly seems to have, and a jury found essentially just that. Now, a lot of people would describe Jeffrey Epstein as a monster. I bridle at that. He was a human being, but there's no question that he committed monstrous acts, decades and decades of monstrous, manipulative, abusive, and illegal acts. And this sense of him as someone who's highly transactional, who's always looking out for number one, trying to, gratify himself monetarily and sexually, emerges unmistakably and I think indisputably, given the number of his victims who have testified with broad consistency to this pattern of preying on young, sometimes underage, sometimes just young women with the assistance of other women in Epstein's orbit or employ, with just horrible abuse, sexual abuse.
The quantities of it, I mean, we know now that John F. Kennedy is said to have needed, when president, sex up to 10 times a day, or he couldn't function. And of course, that was hushed up at the time. It's come out since. But Epstein was of the same sort of dimensions. I mean...
Well, yes, but I think maybe what separates him from a Kennedy, from a Bill Clinton, from many other men throughout the course of history is he's also forcing these women into sexual liaisons with his powerful friends.
Absolutely.
So it's really the most vile behavior, and it lasts for decades.
For decades. And it was really very well organized as far as I can see, because you didn't actually only have Ghislaine assisting him. There were two other women who for some reason have never been charged or investigated, but they're all over the evidence, Sarah Kellen and Nadia Marchinkova. And so he had, in fact, three women who were going to places where young girls would be congregating, be it a Starbucks, be it a school playground, and they would get these kids to come and obviously be overwhelmed by the magnificent surroundings he was living in. And they would get a couple of $100 for giving him a sexy massage. And often somebody like Ghislaine would show them what to do, and she'd give them a sexy massage to educate them in what was required. And then, of course, it didn't even end there, because they were paying these girls a few $100s every time they could bring in one of their friends as new fish into the circle. And it was just this scale of it is...
No, the number of people who enabled this is large. How large, we don't know. Given his circle of acquaintances, there are probably well-known and very wealthy people with a good deal reputationally at stake here that they would prefer remain secret.
And then, of course, what were people like Ehud Barak, Bill Clinton, and so many others? What were they wanting to be on this island for and be friends with him and sign his 50th birthday card to say what a wonderful guy he was? And what was it Clinton said? His delightful childlike curiosity and so forth. I mean, surely it wasn't for his great intellectual company, for his ability to play the piano. I mean, what was behind it? And is that also what explains his incredible wealth when he died, with no obvious source of how he made that wealth legitimately? Was this all an enormous sting blackmail operation at the end of the day? Because, of course, everyone was down in his Rolodex, everyone was being catalogued, and all the proof was found in his safe, all the ledgers, everyone's name. His Rolodex was, couldn't have been more well organized. All these girls, their phone numbers, their parents' phone numbers, their schools, every detail of their lives, all in his safe. A collection of filthy photos and CDs and cassettes recorded. I mean, was this all, do you think, a sting operation by him, that he was somehow getting money from these people in order not to expose them? If not, why were they seeking out his friendship?
You and I don't know the answer to this. It's fun to pull at these threads. It's right to pull at these threads. But in the end, we are speculating about this. I think the possibilities, let me start with the benign. There's no question he's clever. He's witty. He's got a quick mind, not a deep mind, but a quick mind. So for all I know, he's entertaining company at a party or wherever. He's got this beautiful private island down in the U.S. Virgin Islands. That's a nice place to be. He has a private jet. It's certainly fun and heady, I assume, to ride on private jets.
Don't sell him short, Dean. He had 2 private jets.
Okay, all right. So he's got the trappings of wealth and luxury. So the most benign you can say is you're down in a beautiful place in the Virgin Islands on a private island with every whim catered to, every, legitimate whim, food, drink, ease, leisure, good weather, all that. You're surrounded by beautiful young women. You're living the life, so to speak. That's the most benign. The malign possibilities are that you're down engaged in sex trafficking. This is simply a high-class pimp who's procuring for you young, maybe very young girls and women, and you're engaged in sex trafficking, pure and simple, for your selfish base interests and needs, probably because you think you're untouchable. You are famous, you are wealthy, you are beyond reproach. None of this will come back to haunt you because it's all happening offshore on a private island. And these young women, whoever they are powerless and may not be believed, even if they do eventually complain. I at least have no idea where this group of men fell in that spectrum. But at some level, there's a real moral culpability, if nothing else, that attaches when you see what must be going on around you, or you choose to blind yourself to it. That may not be legal culpability, but there's a moral corruption to that at a very minimum.
Oh, guaranteed. And that perhaps brings us to the third of our main characters today, Prince Andrew. So Prince Andrew, now only 65, was the Queen's favourite son, notoriously. But again, notoriously, he's not a bright guy. He's never held a real job. He's never had to. He was for some years a helicopter pilot in the military, and he performed bravely, although there's been plenty of press investigation that suggests he was always kept away from the front line of battle in reality. And then he became a trade ambassador, which really didn't mean much. It meant that he flew all over the world first class and sort of attended important receptions at embassies abroad. And he acquired the name of Air Miles Andy because of that. He had become a close friend of Ghislaine Maxwell, I think in the 90s. And he invited her, and through her boyfriend Epstein, to the most glorious places. There were photos of them at Balmoral, the Queen's famous residence in Scotland. There were photos of them together at the most exclusive parties that Her Majesty gave in Windsor, And there's photos of Epstein and Ghislaine sitting on the throne, which obviously Andrew's brought them to where they're not meant to be and taken a sort of secret selfie. And that's happening in the late 90s and in the early 2000s. And of course, Andrew continues to be friends with Epstein until at least he admits to 2010, but recent emails have shown it's later than that. It's 11 or 12 at least. And he's staying at this Manhattan townhouse in 2010, and they're filmed walking together in Central Park, arm in arm. And then, of course, there's the famous photograph where Virginia Giuff, who committed suicide in 2025, tragically, and she was one of the abused girls. She's photographed with Andrew with his arm around her in a sort of embrace at Ghislaine Maxwell's home in London, and this is in the very early 2000s. So by that stage, Prince Andrew's people must have told him this is not the kind of lady you want to be seen with. And as to her boyfriend, Mr. Epstein, well, he's a very mysterious character because nobody knows where he gets his money from. And there's all sorts of stories floating around about his little sexual peccadillos. So to me, it's amazing that Andrew would continue.
Yeah, they would have warned him about the stink, or at least, the possible stench surrounding Epstein and by extension Maxwell.
Absolutely. It's bizarre. And he was a frequent guest at Epstein's Manhattan townhouse. And the question is, what was he doing there? Because at the same time that he was staying there, the paparazzi were photographing an absolute parade of beautiful, very young ladies who were going in and out of the front door. And when he was asked about it in that car crash of an interview that he gave Emily Maitlis, he said, well, as an honorable man, he wanted to go there to tell him face to face that they would have to stop their close friendship because of the fact that 3 years earlier in Florida, he'd heard that Epstein had entered into this plea deal for sexual offences, and he thought it was now a bad idea to associate with him. You'll understand, dear chap, me being a member of the royal family, and we've got to be very careful. But the dates didn't quite stack up because, as I say, this was 2010 and 2011 that he's still his bosom buddy and sending him emails saying, I look forward to playing together soon, and this sort of thing. So the whole thing stinks, of course, and the most that Andrew could say in his own defense to Emily Maitlis, his excuse was, he said, well, that house was like Grand Central Station. I was staying there a few nights. Well, what do I know who was coming in and out and what they were doing? I just passed them in the hallway and I thought nothing of it. That's literally the best answer he could give. And of course, his private secretary at the time was sacked after this terrible interview, and no wonder, because she had encouraged him to give it in order to clear the air and show how innocent you are to the British people. It was a disaster. Disaster.
That's a good segue into the actual legal cases here, because they at least give us some objective chronological markers.
It's about time you and I started talking about the law, because we've been so engrossed in the gossip, which is so fabulous in this case, isn't it? But let's come to the law. I want to ask you firstly to explain to us what went on in this famous NPA, no prosecution agreement that took place in Palm Beach, Florida in 2007, and which led to him getting a grand total sentence of 13 months to be served in a county jail where the conditions couldn't be better, and he was on day release and going home most of the time.
Well, let's unpack that a little bit. If we go back to 2006, Epstein has his Manhattan townhouse. He has a second home, at least in Palm Beach, Florida, in southern Florida. And there, the local police, the Palm Beach Police Department, become aware of a number of allegations of sexual misconduct with young women or underage girls, both.
I think you should perhaps tell our audience what sort of a place Palm Beach is. The Brits certainly may not know.
It is posh. What it's famous for are the wealthy who live along the ocean. This is on the east side, the Atlantic Ocean side of Florida, down near the southern tip. So setting aside hurricanes, the weather is fabulous. by U.S. standards.
It's a millionaire's playground, as I would put it.
It's a millionaire's playground, to be sure. And Epstein has a large, expensive mansion there. As I say, in 2006, the Palm Beach Police Department begin an investigation when they're getting complaints from young women and girls about what Epstein and Maxwell are engaged in terms of sexual misconduct. They do an investigation to the Palm Beach police. They refer the case to the Palm Beach prosecutor, recommending a number of felony charges, serious felony charges for criminal sexual misconduct. The Palm Beach prosecutor does something that he doesn't have to do under Florida law, which is rather than simply issuing some or all of the felony charges that the police have recommended based on their investigation, he decides to go to a grand jury. A grand jury is just a large jury. Trial jury is called a petit jury, or petit or petty, depending on how badly you mangle the French jury, meaning a small jury of 12. A grand jury is larger than that. In the federal system, it's 23 grand jurors. The various states, it may be as few as 18 or, maybe 16 even, but it's larger than a jury of 12. And a grand jury, where one is used, simply decides, is there a basis to charge someone? Not are they guilty, but is there enough smoke that there may be fire and they ought to be charged with one or more crimes?
Can I just intervene there, Dean? Because you of course got this institution of the grand jury from us. It's English common law. But we scrapped it in 1933. And since 1933, we've had a professional prosecution service of one kind or another. The most recent iteration of that is called the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service. But we don't leave it to jurors anymore to decide whether to put a person on trial, which, as I understand it, is the function of a grand jury. We put them on trial and then they have a proper jury in serious cases, the 12 jury, which you have. But what I want to know is, why have you kept it? Isn't it an incredibly clumsy and, as I understand it, for example, it's prosecution only there and no defense? Just run us through what happens.
Well, it persists in the United States primarily because at the time of the U.S. Constitution, 1787 and the years after, specifically 1791, it becomes a requirement that the federal government use a grand jury if they wish to charge someone with a felony. The Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution has, among its clauses, the so-called grand jury clause. So a minor offense, a misdemeanor, as we still call them, can be charged simply by a United States attorney, by a prosecutor. But a major offense, any felony, by dint of the Fifth Amendment, has to be charged, if charged at all, by a grand jury in the federal system.
So it's constitutional, in which case you can never get rid of it.
Not without amending the Constitution. Now, that's true federally, Jonathan. The U.S. Supreme Court has never said that this federal constitutional requirement of using a grand jury to charge a felony applies to the states. The states are free to use or not use a grand jury. But there's an anchoring effect, I think, historically, because the federal government continues to use, because it must, grand juries to charge felonies. Many states have clung to the grand jury. Now, it must be said that most of those states are like Florida, where the use of the grand jury is optional. It's an option that the prosecutor has available to her if for some reason she wants to hear some of her witnesses and have a grand jury hear the witnesses and assess, are they credible? Are they believable? Do we think the case should go forward?
The prosecution witnesses are called, are they, to give evidence?
Yes, and that goes to your point, which is the prosecutors, and they control the grand jury entirely. The defense can't be there. Can't have a defense lawyer in the room. You can have only one witness at a time in the room. You have a court reporter, the grand jurors themselves, one or more prosecutors, and that's it.
No judge?
No judge. No judge in the room. The judge may impanel the grand jury initially, but once he's done swearing them in, for months, they go about the work under the complete control and scheduling of the prosecutor's office. And so it is a one-sided proceeding, which isn't to say that it's not useful in some respects. The grand jury, understand that to mean the prosecutor, has the power to subpoena witnesses, to subpoena documents or other physical items to be brought in to the grand jury. The grand jury meets in secret. Its deliberations are secret. So only the prosecutor and the witness and the grand jurors know what's happening in that room.
So, Dean, can I just interrupt you? Because to me, this is so, such a bizarre system. So does this mean that a distinguished criminal defense lawyer like yourself has literally never been inside a grand jury room?
I was, but only because I was, for a very short, disastrous time, an assistant U.S. attorney. That is, I was an assistant federal prosecutor. So I've been in a grand jury room. But as a defense lawyer, I'm literally barred at the door by a deputy U.S. Marshal who guards the door to make sure that nobody other than the permitted people get in, and a defense lawyer decidedly is not permitted. So if my client has been subpoenaed, Jonathan, to testify in the grand jury, I can meet with my client beforehand. The client's free to say, I got a grand jury subpoena, free to talk to anybody about it. I can meet with the client, prepare the client, and try to anticipate what the client might be asked. But then the client goes in alone, and I am left in the waiting room outside a locked door. If the client wants to talk to me, the onus is on the client to say, wait a minute, I want to consult my lawyer. And then the client has to step off the witness stand and leave the room. So there are just subtle but effective disincentives, for the client to disrupt the flow of testimony and to assert himself or herself against a prosecutor and against 20 or more grand jurors and leave the room to consult with defense counsel, then go back into the room. So it's entirely controlled by the prosecutors.
Well, in that case, if there's no judge and the prosecutor controls the situation, how do you know that the prosecutor isn't doing the most outrageous things with the witnesses, leading them or putting ideas in their head or getting them to say different things from the truth, as we know a lawyer can do, if unchecked?
You don't necessarily know, and you won't know for a while. But if the grand jury indicts, charges, and now there's to be a trial, and if the prosecution is going to call a witness who was a witness in the grand jury, now the transcript of that witness's testimony and the questions asked to the witness by the prosecutor and the grand jurors, that transcript, the grand jury minutes as they're called, do have to be disclosed to the defense before the trial proper. Also, the prosecution under American law has an ethical obligation, theoretically enforceable by the court, to disclose what's called exculpatory information gleaned in the grand jury investigation. So anything that might call into question guilt or that might mitigate punishment. Is it always disclosed? I doubt it. Is it disclosed usually? Yes. Is it disclosed by honest, ethical prosecutors? Unfailingly. But you are dependent on who the prosecutor is going to call a trial, and secondarily on whether the prosecutor recognizes the exculpatory quality of what he or she has heard in the grand jury. And there, as a lawyer, as well as I do, that we tend to look at our cases as advocates. We look at them through the prism of the end we're trying to achieve. So a prosecutor is trying to establish guilt may in good faith miss the exculpatory, whereas a defense lawyer who's trying to establish an hypothesis, a reasonable hypothesis of innocence, if not more, may instantly see the exculpatory quality of something that the prosecutor has missed.
It's very hard to wear the hat of the other side effectively.
It's very, very hard to wear the other side's hat. The more experienced you become in one role or the other. And in the end, usually, because the obligation to disclose the exculpatory information is the prosecutor's, the judge leaves it to the prosecutor to decide if he or she has complied with their obligation. And that's the gap that can be very difficult to close. Now, What's the value of a grand jury then? Well, for a prosecutor, there's two possible advantages to using a grand jury, even if you don't have to. One, to road test your evidence. Does it feel like it might be a shaky case? How are people off the street going to react to it? You get to road test it. The second is a little bit more cynical. There are situations occasionally where state prosecutors encounter a politically fraught criminal investigation. Maybe the potential defendant is very prominent, or for whatever reason has a lot of support in the community. Maybe there's a good deal of division in the community over whether a crime was or wasn't committed. Close cases and politically fraught for prosecutors, because remember, in our state system, we elect our chief prosecutors. So in those kinds of rare cases, the prosecutor may decide, I don't want to pursue this case, but I don't want to be seen by a segment of the community as the person who decided not to prosecute the case. So what I will do is take it to a grand jury where everything's in secret. I will signal in one way or the other to the grand jury, I don't think you ought to indict this. And when they don't, I can step out with the no bill, as it's called, with the grand jury's decision not to indict, and hold my press conference in public saying, the grand jury chose not to indict. What can I do?
I did all I could.
I did what I could. They make the decision on whether to indict or not. They've decided not to indict. So the prosecutor gets political cover in that situation.
And that brings us to Epstein, because here he is, this very wealthy, well-known denizen of the millionaire's playground of Palm Beach. And what do you know? The grand jury, as I understand it, indict him on about 2% of the stuff that the prosecutor had on him.
Well, they indicted on one charge, one felony charge, not several, as the police had recommended, and a lower felony charge than some the police had recommended. And we still don't know what options the prosecutor presented the grand jury with. That is, the prosecutor draws up a proposed indictment. And when the prosecutor is done calling whatever witnesses he or she is going to call, the prosecutor gives the grand jurors legal instructions, tries to act like a judge and instruct them on relevant law with no check from an actual judge. And then says, here's a proposed indictment. I'll leave it on the table. I'll leave the room as the prosecutor must. You folks deliberate and vote. And at least in the federal system, a bare majority of the grand jurors voting to indict is sufficient to return an indictment. So here's the math in the federal system. This is why you have 23 grand jurors. If 12 federal grand jurors vote to indict, that's sufficient to return the indictment.
Well, I'll tell you something, Dean. I'm learning a lot here today. I didn't know half of this. And I can see why we abolished it in 1933. Sounds to me the most appalling system and capable of being abused. And that brings me straight to a question I want to ask you about our late friend Jeffrey Epstein. To me, as an outsider, as a lawyer, as someone with a bit of experience of life, perhaps, the whole thing stinks, what happened in 2007. And it looks to me as though somebody took a brown envelope, as though influence improperly exercised here.
Well, let's take this step by step.
Yes.
Okay. So we don't know what the Palm Beach prosecutor proposed to the grand jury. We know who testified, just two of the potential victims and a couple of law enforcement people. So it was a thin case. We do know, and this is damning to me, we do know that these young women, the two young women who testified, were told in the grand jury that they themselves, because they'd been paid for these erotic massages, that they themselves could be charged with soliciting prostitution. And worse, to the extent that they knuckled under to Epstein's efforts to get them to procure their friends, to bring their friends by and pay them for doing that, they might be charged with procuring.
And these were just kids. I mean, these were all...
And they were kids. They literally, some of them were kids at the time, under 18.
And they must have been totally terrified by the...
And it's outrageous. It's outrageous. The idea that you would tell these witnesses, be careful what you say, because you yourself could be charged criminally here. The idea that anyone would charge a 16-year-old with prostitution because she's been manipulated into this by a man in full adulthood and his adult consort or friend or, whatever Maxwell was at the time. And, relatively poor kids or kids of modest means being brought into this mansion behind a gate and closed doors. The idea that they would be threatened with prosecution is damning to me.
And by the way, can I just insert here the fact that many of these kids had themselves been abused and come from abusive homes, and some of them had run away from abusive homes.
Yes. They're vulnerable kids. This is very damning, in my view, on the motives or the way that the prosecuting attorney handled this in Palm Beach. And in any event, only the one felony charge is returned. And now the question is, okay, is there a plea agreement to be reached? The police are not satisfied with the actions of the prosecutors. So the police go to the FBI and say, look, there's an injustice that's unfolding in front of our eyes. We're not happy about this. This man looks like he's going to skate, avoid most of the responsibility he should be shouldering. Why don't you FBI agents, why doesn't the federal government get involved, investigate this character and his collaborators?
So you're saying that the police went behind the back of the local prosecutor because they thought he wasn't doing his job efficiently, putting it nicely?
Well, they went to the feds. Whether they sort of defiantly and as a matter of etiquette told the Palm Beach attorney, we're going to do this, or they didn't, I don't know. But in any event, they do go to the feds. The feds open an investigation. And now, learning this, Epstein's very high-powered legal team, you think O.J. Simpson had the dream team. Epstein had that and more, including one lawyer who overlapped. Alan Dershowitz had represented O.J. Simpson back in the mid-90s, and he was on the legal team in 2007 for Jeffrey Epstein, along with Kenneth Starr, famous for being the special prosecutor, independent counsel who pursued Bill Clinton in the Whitewater scandal. Very expensive, very talented lawyers. And so this legal team begins an effort to negotiate with the then U.S. attorney in what's called the Southern District of Florida, which includes Palm Beach, begins negotiating with them to stand down. This is a state investigation, it's a state prosecution, and that's what it should remain. While there's no double jeopardy bar in the United States, it's the federal government taking a second bite at a criminal defendant, even after the state has prosecuted and convicted him. It's usually not done. Usually the feds will not come and bring a second prosecution for the same acts. But they can. And the U.S. attorney, a man named Alex Acosta at the time, appointed by the president, appointed by George W. Bush to that office, says, well, look, what the state is seeking, probation or minimal jail time, is just not enough. And they're also pursuing a charge that would not require Jeffrey Epstein to register as a sex offender under Florida law. And if you want us, the federal government, to stand down, he's going to have to plead guilty to the state charge, do a little bit more time, and plead guilty to a somewhat more serious offense that requires him to register as a sex offender in Florida. So that's the basic negotiation. And the defense team, I think, engages in some hardball tactics, investigates the prosecutors and their personal lives to see if there's grounds that we, might disqualify or embarrass them. It's an all-out approach that only the very wealthy in this country can afford to take in defending themselves. And the upshot in 2008, after months and months, is that, yes, Epstein will plead to 2 state charges, a little more serious. He will do 18 months in jail, is the theory, not in prison, 18 months in jail, and that matters. and he'll agree to register as a sex offender, plus make some restitution to the victim.
Just explain the difference between the jail he eventually went to and a federal prison.
In the U.S., typically, if you go to jail, that's for a term of less than a year, although here it would have been 18 months. More importantly, though, work release during the day is common from U.S. county jails. You're allowed to go out and work and come back to jail at night, or go to school, or go to a medical appointment. In U.S. prisons, you stay behind the fence. You stay behind the wall. And so it's a substantial advantage that Epstein got here to get a jail sentence, not a prison sentence, because he, in fact, was allowed out for most of that time on work release. And although he agreed to and got an 18-month sentence, he only had to do 13 months of that.
And indeed, I've read that his work release meant that he was going home and getting his massages and getting lunch from Ghislaine and this sort of thing much of the time.
Probably.
Well, it's just outrageous. I mean, the man has got away with murder.
Not quite, but he's gotten away. He's gotten away with some very, very ugly, serious crimes for which a less wealthy, less socially positioned man would have gone to prison, period. Probably for a long time. What you're seeing, whether you like it or not, is the way power, money, and privilege change outcomes in the American legal system, and I'll wager in most of the world's legal systems.
Well, I'm not, Lord knows, blind to the deficiencies of the British legal system, but I'd like to think that nothing as outrageous as this could or would happen in Britain. If it has happened, I'm not aware of it. I mean, here is a man with enormous money and power and the ability to have the finest lawyers, as you've said, and not only that, to pull political favors in, to have pressure put on the local prosecutors. And you say that if the feds hadn't said the idea of giving him probation and not being on the sex offenders register is too much, so we've got to have a little bit more than that, which sounds like a fig leaf to cover the situation so everybody can go away and say we did our best. The reality is that this sexual predator and degenerate got away with it to do it again for another 12 years before he died.
Yes, and he himself made a later statement that reveals his attitude in all of its ugliness about this. He bristled when a reporter called him a sex predator and said, "I'm not a predator, I'm an offender, and it's the difference between a murderer and someone who steals a bagel." That kind of entitled, arrogant attitude, I can't add to it. And I accept what you're saying. Maybe this wouldn't have happened in Britain. In the U.S. legal system was revealed here in ways that are ugly. But, my friend, I do have a question for you, even accepting what you say about the British legal system. My question for you is, what has Prince Andrew been charged with criminally for his role in all of this?
Well, of course, nothing, but let's just look at what's happened, because I'm not sure that he could have been in the circumstances. I mean, the first problem is that the lady, Virginia Giuffre, at the time when the infamous photo is taken of him with his arm wrapped around her, and she says that they had sex on this occasion. But it was in London, and in London the law is that a lady over 16 can give consent to sex, and then it's no kind of criminal offense to have sex with her, even though he was, I don't know, at the time, maybe...
But of course she says she never did give a free voluntary consent.
Well,
real consent.
You know, that would be very hard, I think, for anyone to say that if she's doing her deeds of darkness with him and she's looking perfectly happy in that photo and smiling away, and he's taking her to Tramp's nightclub, wasn't he, and to all sorts of nice places. I mean, if I were on a jury, I would never dream of convicting him. I wouldn't believe.
But and I get it, and that might be true in America too. But think about that. So the wealthy, privileged, powerful man manipulates her, shows her off, offers her a peek of a life she'll never get to live, abuses her, and now he can turn around and say she's not believable.
Well, in a funny way.
When she later says, "I wasn't doing this of my free will, of my own unconstrained choice.
But, in a funny way, she got her revenge absolutely in buckets full, because let's remember that in the 2020s, or maybe it was 2019, but anyway, around that time, she now having successfully sued Ghislaine, and there having been a settlement where a lot of money was paid, but it was a secret agreement, so we don't know exactly how much. But she then chanced her arm and she sued Prince Andrew, and she found very competent lawyers, as we know, who were willing to do it, and they did it very bravely. And although he evaded service of the proceedings, he sort of hid behind the closed doors of Windsor Castle. He raised the portcullis over the moat, one might say. But eventually they were able to serve him, and they sued him, and he was hauled over the coals. And you remember how it ended. The Queen had to give him what's believed to be £12 million, which is about $16 million, to pay her off. And the settlement was that nobody admitted liability for anything. And he also gave an awful lot of money to a charity for abused women, with which he was now associated. But of course, he didn't have to admit liability. He was doing this just, because the way one does, you give women over £12 million just because you don't, want to let the side down. But of course, it didn't take in the British public. And he lost all his status from that moment on. A number of his honorary posts were taken from him. Today, he's living the life of a hermit. He lives in some luxury, no doubt, in a house in the grounds of Windsor Castle, in a separate house. But apparently he watches, and I'm quoting from a very excellent recent book about him by Andrew Lowney. And he watches television all day. He goes for an occasional drive or a horse ride. Nobody invites him. The phone doesn't ring. The rest of the royal family shun him. He's not allowed to attend royal events anymore. I mean, he's a pariah. And the press, of course, hound him and are rude about him. And if an article is...
I hear all that, but what I'm also hearing is mommy paid her off. And he's lost some of the perks of nobility, but hardly all of them. And I'm not a fan of sending people to prison. I don't think it does much good on the whole. But anybody else would have seen the inside of a prison, not for months, but for years.
He'd have had to have been in America to have been effectively tried. And he has made sure he hasn't been there ever since, I think, about 2010, when the scandal of Epstein really began to hit the press everywhere. So what a situation we've got, Dean. Summing this up, we've got Palm Beach, where it looks as though if you're big enough and rich enough and powerful enough, you can get away with abusing dozens, if not hundreds, of underage girls. We've got Britain, where if you're Prince Andrew, you can, and mummy's willing to buy the lady off, you can avoid all kinds of liability. You and I have seen this all our careers. Let's be honest about it, haven't we?
Yes, we have, at least at some distance, and occasionally representing the wealthy and the fortunate. But we've left dangling one fascinating legal issue here, which you brought up initially, and that was the details of the non-prosecution agreement for NPA that was negotiated. And that remains important. That remains contested today. When the Fed stood down, when they said, you're going to plead to something a little more serious in state court, you're going to do a little time rather than walk completely free, and you have to register as a sex offender. We, in turn, will agree not to prosecute you federally. Okay, and that was the NPA, the non-prosecution agreement. My understanding is that it was a bit broader, that Epstein's lawyers got a bit more in that non-prosecution agreement, which is you, the United States Attorney for the Southern District of Florida, will not prosecute Jeffrey Epstein for any federal crimes currently under investigation, and you will not prosecute his conspirators.
Co-conspirators.
His co-conspirators, or however they were described. And they were not named, but there's this reference to Epstein or others confederating with him, whatever the language was, okay? Well, that's 2008. Fast forward to 2020, when Ghislaine Maxwell gets indicted herself in a different federal district, not the Southern District of Florida, the Southern District of New York in Manhattan. And she says, wait a minute, you can't do that. Because back in 2008, in Jeffrey Epstein's non-prosecution agreement, you agreed as the United States not to charge those who were assisting or conspiring with Jeffrey Epstein. And I certainly was one of those people, and I was known to the FBI then. I was part of that investigation. And you can't prosecute me on the strength of his non-prosecution agreement down in Southern District of Florida. Fascinating. Now, I've run into this, Jonathan. I've run into this very problem. And the problem arises because when you enter into a non-prosecution agreement, the U.S. Attorney's Office signs as counsel for the United States of America. These agreements tend not to say, just in this district, but they say the United States agrees. Well, the United States has 93 or 94 federal judicial districts. And what I've learned the hard way is that most federal law holds that a U.S. attorney in a given district can bind only his district. He or she doesn't bind the other U.S. attorneys in the other federal districts. But it's always rankled me. I mean, you signed on behalf of the United States. You're overseen by and a unit of the United States Department of Justice. You're in the position to know whether there are other investigations out there in other districts, not I. And when you say the United States won't pursue further charges against me or against, named or unnamed people specified in the agreement, I expect that's not just this district. But that's not the way the law stands, as I understand it.
I have read the NPA, the non-prosecution agreement. When I read it, it did seem to me that they're not saying this only applies in the Southern District of Florida.
They're not.
There's reference to the United States government will not prosecute you any further. And of course, this was a federal prosecution or non-prosecution agreement. And then when Ghislaine was tried in 2021 in New York, these were federal charges of which she was convicted. And although the trial judge, as I understand it, she raised the same argument, the trial judge dismissed it. She then took it to the Circuit Court of Appeals. They dismissed it, but she's got an outstanding petition, even as we speak, to the Supreme Court. And Justice Sotomayor apparently has given her an extension of time in which to file her papers. And it did seem to me that she's got a very, shall we say, arguable case on this.
Well, I've mixed feelings about this, but let's unpack it. First of all, let's go back to that first-rate legal team. Roy Black, a very prominent Miami lawyer at the time, who just died in July of this year, was on that. Kenneth Starr, very prominent lawyer. Alan Dershowitz.
And let's just say here, I've heard Dershowitz speak many times, literally at my local synagogue only a few months ago. I mean, I love him. The man's 85 and he's lucid, brilliant, entertaining, just a 5-star plus legal mind, isn't he? We would both agree.
I think that's right. Whatever else one might say about him, I think that's right. Now, he's not a trial lawyer, at least not in recent decades. But Roy Black was one of the best trial lawyers in Southern Florida. And there were others who were very much aware of trial dynamics. They must have known the law stacks up against us on binding any district other than this one to an NPA. So we ought to be asking for different wording in the NPA. We ought to be asking for an explicit anywhere in the United States, and we ought to get the Justice Department to sign off on that. And so there may have been a gap there in the performance of that defense team, possibly.
I agree with you. They must have known that this was moot. But maybe they thought they'd pushed the boat out as far as they could, that if they tried to push it out because after all, what they got for him was just, Christmas coming twice that year. And
Yes.
maybe they thought if they asked for any more, they would jeopardize the whole thing. And maybe they thought they were better leaving it ambiguous because it might never arise. And if it did, that they had the argument that's now being made.
Quite possible. In fact, I think even likely. That just smacks of reality to me. And there's another factor in play. So far as we know, nobody representing Ghislaine Maxwell was involved directly in those negotiations. This was an agreement between the U.S. and Jeffrey Epstein. She's not a party to this agreement, which makes her at best a third-party beneficiary of it. And I think that further complicates her efforts to enforce the notion that not only did it extend beyond the Southern District of Florida to the Southern District of New York, but that it also is enforceable by her, who was a non-party to the agreement in the first instance. A further complication that I think her legal team now faces on post-conviction challenges to her guilty verdict is that I don't know that the investigation that led to her 2020 indictment in Manhattan had even begun by the time this NPA was signed in 2008. And what is clear is that even with a non-prosecution agreement, you're not getting a free pass for future crimes you may commit. At most, you're getting a pass for what's known or already occurred or is currently under investigation.
But of course, another odd feature of Ghislaine's case is that the counts for which she was convicted in 2021 were old allegations. They all dated from the 90s. About 1995, the 4 girls who gave evidence against her, none of whom was Virginia Giuff, incidentally, but the 4 girls who were the witnesses were relating historic abuse by Epstein and Ghislaine in the mid-1990s. So many years before the plea deal.
Agreed, but necessarily those, at least some of those events would have had to occur in Manhattan. Not in Palm Beach, but in Manhattan. You couldn't venue the prosecution in the Southern District of New York unless crimes had happened there. Some of them.
They'd been in his townhouse, apparently.
Right. And what I just don't know factually is, were the crimes, alleged crimes at the time, in his townhouse in Manhattan already under investigation in 2008? I don't know the answer to that. But that will be an additional obstacle that she'll face, I predict, in challenging her conviction.
One suspects probably not, and I'll tell you why I say that they probably weren't yet being investigated, because it's the successful case of Virginia Giuff, who later committed suicide, against Ghislaine, and later against Prince Andrew, even though neither case came to court, but because they both settled in her favor, as the whole world's press related, therefore that brought these other girls out of the woodwork, and that's how the federal investigation that led to Ghislaine being tried in 2021 happened. These girls came out of the woodwork having seen the success of Virginia Giuff. So the chances are they weren't being investigated, as you point out.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and that makes sense to me. I don't know the answer, but I think it is true that victims of this kind of thing often feel intimidated. They feel at risk from the power and the money of the people whose liberty would be at stake, and they feel like they won't be listened to. They won't be believed. They won't have any traction against wealthy, powerful people. Once somebody does have some success, now, other victims may be more willing to come forward. And yes, is there the possibility that people who aren't really victims will say, well, this looks like something, there may be some money down the line in it for me or whatever. There is that possibility. I don't think that happens much. In the real world, I actually don't think that happens much.
Well, in a later case that you and I look forward to discussing, which is Kevin Spacey, who was tried in England and indeed acquitted on a whole range of sexual allegations involving young actors who were learning under him or watching his fabulous acting classes and this sort of thing. The same thing happened, that one made an allegation and then a torrent of others had seen it and heard about it, and they made allegations too. So, as you say, this is really quite common in this class of case, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is. I want to turn to something else, Jonathan, with you, which is what I can only speak from my own experience, but what I've experienced in federal court, especially, as a sort of soft sexism in the federal criminal enforcement system. And what I mean by that is the starting point for most prosecutors, again, in my experience, and law enforcement officers, is to the extent that there are women who are within the scope of the investigation as possible, criminally culpable actors, they are assumed usually to be under the control of men. They're assumed to have less culpability than the male actors if there are men and women. That there's an assumption that the women must have been manipulated by or subservient to the men. And you look forward as a defense lawyer, in my experience, to representing a woman in a group criminal investigation or indictment, because you will be able to argue effectively often that there's little or no culpability, that the social dynamics being what they actually are, the men were running this operation, the men were controlling the women, the men were using the women.
It's what I always call the wife's defense. My husband did it. Did I know he was doing it? No, of course not. Just because the drugs were under the bed doesn't mean I'd ever seen them there. Yes, of course.
Or I knew, but what could I do? I was afraid of him, or he's volatile, or whatever, right? And of course, it doesn't always play out that way. I'm talking about a kind of starting presumption that's familiar to me in the criminal enforcement system, that the women probably are not culpable, or at least are less culpable.
Yes.
And indeed here, I don't know to what extent, if at all, that was at play here, but Jeffrey Epstein gets indicted in 2019, and look who's not charged in 2019. Ghislaine Maxwell is not charged. She's not indicted in 2019 when Epstein is. And then, of course, he dies. He can't be tried. The case has to be dismissed after his death. And only in 2020 does Ghislaine Maxwell then get indicted in the same district for many of the same crimes.
Let's just interrupt to make a point that not all our audience may know, which is that in the British and American systems, and indeed all the common law systems, if a criminal defendant dies, that's an end of the proceedings. The trial cannot go on in his absence. Now, that's not the same in many civil law countries. The trial can go on in his absence, and even though the fellow's dead, they go through the procedure and find him guilty or not guilty, as the case may be, for the sake of history or his reputation or whatever, but not in our systems.
Well, right. And maybe there's something subtle at work there. Our systems tend to focus on punishment. So you don't try a corpse because you can't punish a corpse. If a system is more focused on truth finding, in the end, just trying to get to the truth of it all, which I think at their best, civil or inquisitorial systems are quite, at their best, are focused on truth finding, then there might be value to just trying to sort out the facts, even though there's no punishment that can be imposed on the deceased, of course. In any event, she gets charged only after he dies.
What you're saying, and I think this is true, that if he hadn't died, nobody would ever have gone for her. But she was a substitute because that's all they could go for, and the public were demanding that somebody paid the price for this outrageous behavior, he having gotten away with it in 2008.
I suspect, I don't know, I have no idea, but my hunch is that what was going on is that she and her lawyers were in negotiations about whether they would be government witnesses against Epstein in his trial. And that ideally, from her perspective, by agreeing to be a government witness, she wouldn't face any charges at all.
Yes.
Once he's dead, that sort of leverage disappears. She isn't needed as a witness against him anymore. And now, as you say, she may become the proxy for the public anger, for the understandable public outrage at what these two people did for decades. And I do think it's entirely possible that she wouldn't have been charged at all had he lived to stand trial and been convicted at least. I think it's likely that if she were prosecuted, assuming the case had, gone to completion against Jeffrey Epstein, that if she were prosecuted, she would have faced nothing like the actual 20 years she got in prison.
I was going to say that sentence seems to me so excessive. I mean, trying to translate the same situation were it to have occurred in Britain and she'd done just the same things that are alleged, she'd never have got more than 5 or 6, in Britain and served half of that.
That's one difference between our two countries. The sentences here are just longest average sentences in the world, I think, in this country, at least in the developed world. And as somebody who's lived in the United States all his life and practiced here for 40 years, there's nothing about 20 years that's unsurprising.
Really?
And in theory, you have to do 85% of that.
Yes.
Now, the reality is she won't do 85%, even if she lives that long, but she'll do more than half of that time, if assuming the conviction stands. She's not pardoned or it's not overturned on some basis at some point.
I mean, to do 20 years...
there was nothing striking about that 20 years if you assume that she's the principally culpable person here, or at least, is a fully culpable person. I'm just saying that had Epstein lived to be tried, convicted, and sentenced, now I can't imagine her having also gotten 20 years.
No.
And I can imagine him having gotten a sentence longer than 20 years. Probably longer than 20 years would be my expectation.
So you're saying that had he lived and had she stood trial with him in the same dock, although as you've said, had he lived to be tried, there's nothing to suggest they would ever have gone against her at all had he lived to be tried. But let's imagine that he had been tried with her in the same dock and that both had been convicted. What do you think then she would have been looking at by way of sentence?
I don't know. Judge Nathan, that's a hypothetical.
Of course.
I can't give you any precise answer. All I am comfortable saying is my hunch is she would have gotten something well under 20 years.
Yes.
Had she been charged, either tried with him or tried separately and later. But had he survived, to pay most of the price, so to speak, of that conduct, I think she would have gotten less than 20 years. Well, now, it's interesting. This sort of, I'm calling it soft sexism. This is particularly interesting if you consider the history, both our two countries and the world to some extent, of the role of women in the sex trade, as madams of brothels or as procuresses. There's thousands of years of women at least being visible managers or participants in sex trafficking or the sex trade. I suspect that men have always enjoyed a lion's share of the profits from that, but women have often been the visible managers, if you will, or directors of this sort of trade. And that's, that role as a procuring person is just interesting to me, is it's not new with women having the kind of involvement that Maxwell was alleged and then later proven to have here.
On the other hand, the prosecution did show, didn't they, at her trial, that she'd had about $30 million from Epstein by way of wages and payments and jewels and so forth over the relevant period. So she hadn't done badly. And this was a girl who, when she met him, was really down on her uppers, and she only had an income of £100,000 a year from the last remaining of Daddy's trust funds.
To be sure, she profited from this. And as I say, it appears to me she was a willing long-term participant in this. Now, what the dynamics were as between the two of them, how much she was manipulated or controlled, whatever the answer to that is, it looks to me like for purposes of criminal liability, she was a sufficiently voluntary participant. And as you say, she profited greatly. It's just her own sexual cravings weren't apparently being satisfied by this.
No, she was.
Her own libido wasn't driving the crimes. It would have been her greed.
She was his enabler. She was his sort of secretary, right-hand woman, as best one can tell.
And some of the victims have directed more of their scorn at her than at him.
They did. They hated her more than him in a way, didn't they, some of them? Dean, I want to ask you a different question, because you and I have discussed the Ghislaine trial privately at some length. And I want to ask you, if you had been defending her instead of whoever was defending her, what would you have done differently? And then I'll tell you what I would have done differently had this same case been in a British court. But let me just tell you amusingly, before we even get to hear your answer, that actually I did receive a phone call from a certain person who was an intermediary from her brothers. And there was a time when I thought you and I might be defending her, but it unfortunately didn't happen. Maybe we were too expensive, but for whatever reason, it never happened. But we were actually at one stage in the beauty contest, it seems. However, back to my question. If you had been defending her in New York, what would you have done differently?
This is a question I'm going to duck like I do every time. I've never met her, never talked to her. I don't know what her story is. I know she was well represented, and I'm confident that we weren't too expensive, that she could have paid whatever lawyers were demanding or asking. But I don't know in the end, because unless one gets in and actually reads all of the discovery from the investigation and goes through it all with the client and assesses, are they credible? What do they have to say? What's their attitude about testifying? What defense are they proposing or offering? Unless one has that advantage, you really can't know how you would have defended it. I think to a limited extent, you can say, well, defense lawyers should have done this, or they did that well, or whatever. But what I might have done differently, there's no way for me to know that. There's absolutely no way to know that. I can say in a general way, Jonathan, that the heavy presumption you would bring as a barrister in England to calling your own client in the defense isn't the same here. That same leaning toward, I will call my client as a witness unless there's every reason not to. It doesn't translate to this side of the Atlantic. I think it's, for most of us, a much more open question whether to stand on the privilege against self-incrimination, the right to not take the stand as the accused, or whether to testify. Now, there's actual differences in English and American law today. There's a more robust instruction to the jury in the United States that they cannot consider the fact that the accused didn't testify in any way as suggesting guilt or anything else or undermining the presumption of innocence than there is in the United Kingdom, I think, today. And to be sure, I want to be clear, yes, American lawyers have personal preferences. I like to call my client. I don't like to call my client. There's lawyers on both sides of that. But I think what I can say safely is there's no great presumption that you'll call your client.
Well, I'm not going to be as diffident as you. I mean, you've given me what is the textbook answer that until you actually meet your client and know the details of the case, you can't say. And of course, I go along with that. But I'm going to say this, that it seems to me there was no way of getting this lady an acquittal unless you called her. And I say that because all the defense did at her trial, they had two lines of defense. One was to attack the credibility of the four victims. So they were looking for whatever minor inconsistencies they could glean from their previous accounts to the investigators and things of that kind, and looking for small holes they could punch in the story. But there was nothing major. I mean, basically, the four girls were good witnesses, and basically the story they were giving was pretty much identical in every case in terms of the modus operandi. So to me, that was never going to be good enough to just sort of suggest, oh, you can't believe them. Well, why not? Maybe not one or two, but once you've got four telling the same story, it's starting to look at, what would Oscar Wilde say? It's, to lose one parent is a misfortune. To lose two starts to look like carelessness. So I would have called her, because the defense that cried out to be made in this case was surely that she herself was abused by Epstein and was a victim of Epstein in a slightly different way. But just as they were, she was under his control, his power, his spell, his money. And not only that, she'd had a father who treated her in the same way. So the poor girl never had a chance. That's what I would have done had I been defending in this case, certainly in Britain.
Well, and there almost surely is an element of truth to all of
For
that.
sure.
And I guess, all the photographs that could have been adduced to show them looking lovingly at each other and, living the high life together, all of those could have been explained in much the same way that the photographs of the victims with Epstein looking like they were having a good time, or, there willingly would have been explained. Now, I will say this, Jonathan, because I didn't mean to be evasive. It's just a question I can't honestly answer. But I will say this. We do have the depositions that she gave in 2016 and in civil litigation.
Yes.
Those are available. And she comes across as a defiant, combative witness. And if that had played itself out on a witness stand in her own trial, I wonder if a jury would have accepted that she was but the meek, manipulated, submissive, and subservient victim of Epstein herself for purposes of her own criminal liability.
Well, of course, you and I would have advised her, if you come over that way, you're dead. You've got to be meek, mild, pleasant, and humble. So, that's part of what we do when we defend, isn't it? We give advice on how people should.
Yes, and those depositions could have been used to impeach her at her own trial. They were sworn testimony.
Yes, no doubt.
Prior statements of the defendant.
Another thing they did, and this was the only other line of defense, as best I can see, having studied the trial in some little depth, they called a false memory expert. In other words, some psychiatrist or psychologist.
Oh, an excellent one. Not just some psychologist, Dr. Elizabeth Loftus, magnificent academic psychologist.
Who gives evidence that, people can, going back to the 90s as they were, which is, nigh on 25 years ago, they can get false memory syndrome and this and that and the other. Well, I've called one of these people. Have you had occasion to?
Yes. I both cross-examined and called.
Yes, I've cross-examined as well. Well, I'm reminded of what the Duke of Wellington said when he took a parade of his own troops before the Battle of Waterloo. And he said, I don't know what they do to the enemy, but by God, they terrify me. And that's the way I'm afraid I always feel about these kind of psychologists and psychiatrists, although I've called dozens of them and cross-examined hundreds of them. But they terrify me. I don't know. I think that was just never going to succeed, that maybe the memories are false because people have false memories. I've called such a person in a case where the main witness was 5 years old, giving evidence as to how kids get it wrong, essentially, and it's part of, the way the brain matures. Okay, but in this particular case, to me, that was never going to wash. So anyway, I look at this case for what it's worth, and I say, if only I'd had the pleasure and honor to defend her, I'd have done it differently. But I suppose it's always easy to criticize from the outside. You and I have to recognize that. Probably we've been criticized from the outside as well, probably unfairly on occasion.
And in my case, probably rightly so. But there's a kind of a point of agreement, I think, here between us. The vagaries of memory are real, and there's no question that, as lay people and as professionals, we overestimate the reliability of memory. And we make the mistake of thinking that memory works like a video camera and you're playing it back in your head. That's not how memory works.
Indeed.
Memory is much more problematic than that. And at the same time, all of that accepted, okay, all of that perfectly accepted, or at least I accept all that. 4 witnesses, and the basic outlines of what happened, you're not going to sell that as false memories, entirely false memories. The basic outlines of what happened to me, what did these people do to me, with 4 people giving essentially consistent stories, I'm right with you. In the end, it's interesting, it's true that memory is more problematic than we think, but that doesn't change the fact in the end that you might be rightly persuaded as a jury beyond a reasonable doubt that these folks did the things they're charged with doing.
That's our conclusion to the Epstein saga, a case that refuses to stay buried. Next week, we shift to Hollywood and scandal, examining fame, power, and the reckoning of Kevin Spacey. But for now, I rest my case.